As many of you may be aware, this evening's lecture was established 10 years ago to honor the late Donald Tansley for his remarkable career as a senior public servant in Canada. An alumni of the University of Saskatchewan, Donald Tansley began his career as a public servant in the Budget Bureau under the guidance of Al Johnson. Throughout his career, Tansley was known for leading some of the most complex and contentious files in provincial government, from rescuing the Interprovincial Steel Company, or IPSCO, from bankruptcy, to implementing Medicare in Saskatchewan, to leading modernization of the provincial government in New Brunswick, and implementing highly controversial policies such as the Program of Equal Opportunity. In 1968, Tansley turned to the federal public service, where he served as Vice President of the Canadian International Development Agency, advisor to the Red Cross, CEO of the controversial Anti-Inflation Board, and finally he led the development of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Whatever the challenge, Donald Tansley's character and commitment to the public service always shone through. He could often be heard encouraging his colleagues to not give up, to find strength in finishing the job, and to take harsh judgments with a grain of salt. Perhaps some of these same themes of commitment and endurance will come through tonight in our keynote address. With that, I'm pleased to introduce the 2017 Tansley speaker, Mr. Colin Robertson. A former Canadian diplomat, Colin is Senior Advisor to Dentons LLP, working with the Business Council of Canada, and is the Vice President and a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He is Executive Fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy and a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Living in Ottawa, Colin focuses on Canadian global policies, including writing a column every 2 weeks for the Globe and Mail. A career Foreign Service officer from 1977 to 2010, he served as the first head of the Advocacy Secretariat and minister at the Canadian Embassy in Washington and Consul General in Los Angeles. His previous assignments were as consul and counselor in Hong Kong, and he has some very interesting stories about his time there, I can tell you that, and in New York at the UN and Consulate General. In his first assignment, he directed a project, in his final assignment, he directed a project at Carleton University's Center for Trade Policy and Law with the support of the federal and provincial governments and the private sector on Canada-U.S. engagement. As a member of the team that negotiated the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and the North American Free Trade Agreement, he is co-author of Decision at Midnight, The Inside Story of Canada-U.S. FTA. He was also co-editor of Diplomacy in the Digital Age, Essays in Honor of Ambassador Alan Gottlieb, and editor of Bout de Papier, Canada's Journal of Foreign Service and Diplomacy. He has taught at Carleton University, Queen's University Public Executive Program, and the Canada School of Public Service. He served as president of the Historica Foundation and as president of the Professional Association of Foreign Service Officers. In 2004, Colin won the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Manitoba, and he was given the, quote, Hot Potato Award for helping to increase collaboration between U.S. and Canadian organizations and stakeholders at the 2012 Pacific Northwest Economic Regions Summit. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Colin Robertson.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was very generous and probably a little long, but I hope it allowed those of you who want to get a drink a little more time. It is an honor to deliver this lecture. I thank the Johnson Shoyoma School for the invitation and those at the University of Regina who have helped me get here. Particular thanks to my friends Dale Eisler and Doug Moyne for their advice, and to my brother Neil who got me here tonight. I met Donald Tansley, Al Johnson, and Tommy Shoyama when I first arrived in Ottawa. While I did not pretend to have known them, I knew their reputations and I took their measure. What always struck me about that generation of public servants was that this was a generation tempered by war. Tansley served with the Regina Rifles. Neil and I would retrace their steps, characterized by valor and sacrifice at Juno Beach on D-Day and after. I think it gave them a perspective of life that guided them through their public service. Nor did they suffer fools. I know this from personal experience, having later served under their colleague Simon Gunnar Reisman when we negotiated the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. As public servants, they were never bureaucrats. They believed in the power of ideas and in vigorous policy discussion. As Johnson would later write of their time in Saskatchewan, they, quote, dreamed no little dreams, unquote, and believed in government as a force for good. They took this attitude to Ottawa when they migrated as members of the Saskatchewan Mafia, who served the governments led by Mike Paterson and Pierre Trudeau. Policy implementation was a piece. You had to make things work. But putting things in auto drive was not their thing. They sought to build a better Canada. The disappointment of our current government, that of Justin Trudeau, in the public service is not their lack of enthusiasm or loyalty, but the lack of ideas and the inability to dream big dreams. Donald Tansley, Al Johnson, Tommy Shoyama were examples of what public service can and should be. They set the bar for succeeding generations of public servants. It is why we continue to honor their contribution to our public life. Like most things in life, I came to Canada-U.S. relations through time and chance. I'm a child of the 50s, a prairie boy who came to public service through a combination of admiration for Lester B. Mike Pearson's internationalism and the stature and self-confidence that helpful fixing gave to Canada and public service, thanks to the example set by Tansley, Johnson, and Shoyama, who saw this as high calling and as an honorable profession. As an undergraduate, I read Charles Ritchie's The Siren Years. Ritchie, who would go on to become our ambassador to Washington during John F. Kennedy's presidency, wrote of life in London during the Blitz. He worked with Pearson, Georges Vanier, and Vincent Massey, Governor Generals. At our High Commission, he met the King and Queen, and he bedded ballerinas. It convinced me that the Foreign Service was the life for me. I was never disappointed in the Foreign Service, although in the later years, the advent of political correctness, senseless accountability, and a government that didn't care much for its foreign service tested my endurance. My first assignment was in the UN Bureau, where I worked for Jeffrey Pearson, son of Lester Pearson. Through him, I met the inimitable Charles Ritchie. I was posted to the General Assembly in the United Nations in New York, where I met John Holmes, a protege of Pearson, who by then was at the Canadian Institute of International Affairs. Holmes was one of that generation of Canadians who helped engineer the post-war international institutions, the United Nations, the IMF, World Bank, GATT, now the WTO, and the alphabet soup of agencies, including the FAO, WHO, UNHCR, that continue to underline international peace and security. Holmes was in the process at that time of writing a book on Canada-U.S. relations. He remained a steadfast advocate for the rules-based liberal international system that gave middle powers like Canada a seat, often temporarily, at the great powers table. Holmes embodied the Pearsonian idea of functionalism, the recognition within the international system that competence, not power, should determine membership and weight in the specialized agencies dealing with the issues like food and refugees that gave middle powers like Canada place and standing. But Holmes recognized that the United States was the anchor and guardian of our rules-based liberal international system. His advice to me was to specialize and to better understand the United States. For Canada, he told me, it would always be the United States and then the rest. Holmes didn't like anti-Americanism and the Canadian temptation to be smug and superior. Stern daughter of the voice of God was how Dean Acheson, a former American Secretary of State, famously described this unfortunate Canadian characteristic. Like most Canadians, I plead guilty to describing myself by what we are not, Americans. And I will never forget, after a session of self-satisfied grousing with fellow junior diplomats at the United Nations Delegates Lounge, a Polish diplomat, older than the rest of us, he'd endured the Second World War, the Nazis, and then Soviet occupation, quietly observed to me, "Would you rather be us?" There is a natural insecurity that comes from living next door to Goliath. As Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau memorably quipped at the National Press Club in Washington, quote, "Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even tempered the beast, one is affected by every twitch and grunt." Fortunately, my children's generation doesn't seem to suffer this affliction. Instead, as the jingle from the Vancouver Whistler Olympics put it, they want to own the podium. That's progress of which we should be proud. One of my mentors and the longest-serving ambassador to the United States, Alan Gottlieb, reminds me that the United States is more than a country, it is a civilization. And the rules-based liberal international order that most of us grew up under, and which, as I say, has preserved the peace, not imperfectly, but certainly better than any other period in world history, was created by and sustained by American leadership. Holmes believed that we had to cut the U.S. some slack. There was always a trapdoor for the great powers, and as great powers go, the United States used the privilege sparingly. It was important, he argued, that we be a good and trusted neighbor to the United States because, as he wrote in his book, Life with Uncle, we could tell them when their breath was bad. For me, Holmes' Life with Uncle, the name of his book, and Alan Gottlieb's I'll Be With You in a Minute, Mr. Ambassador, remain the two best guides to active practitioners in Canada-U.S. relations. I kept copies at my desk when I served in Washington. Their advice also helped focus my own thinking on managing Uncle Sam in the Trump administration. As you can see, I took Holmes' career advice to focus on the United States. I returned to New York to work at our Consulate General for Ken Taylor, that most cool of Canadian diplomats and a true hero. I served in Los Angeles as Consul General, then in Washington as the first head of the Advocacy Secretariat. I was also a member of the Canadian team that negotiated the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and the North American Free Trade Agreement. My travels have taken me to every state in the Union. On Canada-U.S. relations, I reckon I've done my 10,000 hours, Malcolm Gladwell's definition of deliberate practice to become competent. But, I confess, the election of Donald Trump surprised me. I think we'll now test to see whether this is going to go. Oh yes, there he is, perfect. The Trump phenomenon. Donald Trump is not a typical president. According to the Washington Post, during his first 70 days in office, he has made 343 false or misleading claims. As Winston Churchill once observed, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. Mr. Trump is not an establishment Republican. He quickly dispatched Jeb Bush, Little Marco as he called him, and then the rest. He defeated the conservative standard-bearer, as he called him, lying Ted Cruz. And while he didn't win the popular vote, he took the Electoral College from, as he called her, Crooked Hillary. That the Russians intervened in the U.S. election is incontestable, according to the intelligence agencies, although whether he won because of their intervention is an open question. Don't underestimate Mr. Trump. He went into the campaign with only a 1% probability of winning the Republican nomination, and on the day of the election was still given odds of less than 1 in 3 of becoming president. Trump confounds not just Canadians, and if the surveys are right, most Americans, and certainly the rest of the world. I think he won because Americans wanted change from a Washington that they felt no longer worked for them. Trump appealed to the feeling of loss of control. The wall would restore integrity to borders. The Muslim ban would keep out migrants and terrorists. As master of the art of the deal, he'd restore made in America and keep out foreign goods, and he'd drain the swamp in Washington. As one journalist put it, Trump's supporters took him seriously, but not literally, while the elite, the rest of us, took him literally but not seriously. Trump's messaging, including his early hour tweets, continued to be simple, persuasive, appealing. Make America Great Again, America First, Buy American, Hire American. As he said in his inaugural address, the forgotten men and women in America are forgotten no longer. Everyone is now listening to you. Donald Trump, the Tribune of the People. Some of the messaging and the appeal to protectionism and isolationism and nativism accounts for the surprising Brexit vote and is now at play in the forthcoming French and German elections. Is Canada immune from these frustrations? By this I mean the sense that the system isn't fair and that the system has created advantages for some, the lack of trust in our institutions, the divide between those who have and those who don't, and the sense that our kids will be worse off than we were. I don't think so. I think that the conundrum around fairness and inequality, not climate, not terrorism, is the really big public policy challenge for our time. We need to take President Trump seriously and as we are learning, often literally. With 3/4 of Canada's exports headed to the U.S., this is our key market. We cannot change our geography, nor, I think, would we want to. Let's see if this is where I call for there we are. For those of you who take a look at this map, this is if countries were, the economists originally put this out, if countries if states were nations, California, for example, economy the size of France, New York, economy the size of Canada, Texas, the size of Brazil. This is why the United States is the preferred market around the world. We enjoy preferred access to this market. Now we're going to have to negotiate to preserve that access. Our prosperity and security depend on it. Canadian policy will require care, circumspection, and engagement, and above all, engagement. As we go into the trade negotiations with the Trump administration and Congress, active engagement by Canadians, armed with a clear sense of our national objectives, is crucial to success. This means all hands on deck and a game plan supported by all levels of government. This being Canada, this also means achieving consensus, not unanimity. To remind ourselves, we fought an election around free trade in 1988. Only 3 provinces, Quebec, Alberta, and Manitoba, gave the Progressive Conservative government of Brian Mulroney a majority of their votes. But free trade worked for Canada. It resulted not just in prosperity, but an attitudinal shift on the part of Canadians. Where once we wondered about our capacity to compete internationally, we are now confident that we can truly own the podium. I am aware of the controversy around the global transportation hub, but the concept of inland ports with global reach is exactly what Saskatchewan and Canada should be doing. Where once premiers were divided about the merits of free trade, today every premier, regardless of political stripe, is out on the international circuit promoting trade. Premier Wall, as we heard from the minister tonight, is in Washington this week, engaged in developing new relationships and building on those that he already has. His ongoing message is about the vitality and mutual benefits of our trading relationship. Although it is not appreciated in the United States, NAFTA worked for the Americans as well as Canadians. The NAFTA, which improved the free trade agreement and brought Mexico, helped spark a decade-long economic advance in all 3 nations. Some facts gathered by the Council on Foreign Relations that are not generally known or appreciated by Americans. First fact, U.S. trade with its North American neighbors has more than tripled, growing more rapidly than U.S. trade with the rest of the world. Second fact, from research from the Paterson Institute, concluded that nearly 200,000 export-related jobs are created annually by the pact pay 15 to 20% more on average than the jobs that were lost. Third factoid, Canada and Mexico are the 2 largest destinations today for U.S. exports, accounting for more than 1/3 of the total. Last factoid, some 14 million jobs rely on trade with Canada and Mexico, 9 million with Canada alone, according to a study conducted by the Canadian Embassy. Canadian companies operating in the United States employ directly nearly 500,000 Americans. These facts need to be underlined to our American friends again and again in the coming months. A word about Mexico. Mexico is now Canada's third largest trading partner and our entree to the Americas. While Canada and Mexico will pursue their own interests in these negotiations, as sovereign countries do, we need to keep in close contact because divide and conquer is integral to Mr. Trump's art of the deal. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his cabinet are doing, I think, an effective job of outreach to the Trump administration, Congress, and now into the states, especially those states that voted for Mr. Trump. In a speech before the election, Justin Trudeau remarked that a former Prime Minister, and not the one you think, once said to him that the Prime Minister has three big responsibilities. The first, grow the economy. Second, unify the country. And third, successfully manage the relationship with the United States. As Trudeau put it, for our American cousins, the relationship is consequential. For us, it has often been definitional. The advice on priorities came from Brian Mulroney. The Prime Minister who best understands the Canada-U.S. dynamic. As Mr. Mulroney, whom Mr. Trudeau has smartly enlisted in the outreach to the Trump team, observed, the golden rule of Canada-U.S. relations is very simple. We can disagree without being disagreeable. The Americans are very important to us. We know they are, notwithstanding the differences, our best ally, our closest neighbor, our biggest customer. Mulroney, speaking at the time in Washington, a tribute to Ronald Reagan, went on to add, there is also a golden rule of global politics. Canada's influence in the world is measured to a significant degree by the extent to which we are perceived as having real influence in Washington. I think Trudeau has practiced well what former U.S. Ambassador Gordon Giffen called the Goldilocks rule of Canada-U.S. relations. Don't let the relationship get too close. Mulroney and Reagan were accused sometimes of being too close. And we Canadians like some distance, but don't let it get too cool either. I think Mr. Trudeau has found the right temperature and created the right team for our negotiations, putting Chrystia Freeland, who brought home both country of origin labeling and the Canada-Europe agreement as both foreign minister and minister responsible for trade with the United States, is very smart. Having former General Andrew Leslie as parliamentary secretary is also a good move. He knows personally Generals McMaster, National Security Advisor, Mattis, Secretary of Defense, and Kelly, Homeland Security Secretary. General Leslie, as you probably know, joined Premier Wall recently in Iowa, where they spoke to the Iowa legislature and met with Governor Terry Branstad, whom Mr. Trump has nominated as U.S. Ambassador to China. Thinking of strategic federal-provincial collaboration, that's what I think Canadians want to see. You may recall that when Prime Minister Trudeau was in Houston recently, he told an American energy executive audience that pipelines and action on climate were entirely compatible. And he was joined by Alberta Premier Rachel Notley. He also warned, to the applause of the American audience, that a border adjustment tax would hurt both economies. I also think we have the right team in Washington. Our ambassador, David McNaughton, is shrewd and unflappable, the right temperament for these volatile times. He has the ear of the Prime Minister, and in quarterbacking the outreach to the Trump team has been very effective. Our negotiating team will be headed by Steve Verhoeven, our chief negotiator for the Canada-Europe trade agreement. He's well known to his provincial counterparts through his role as the CETA chief trade negotiator. Saskatchewan farming community will be pleased because he cut his negotiating teeth on agriculture. Like McNaughton, Verhoeven is also low-key and effective. He will lead an experienced team, many of whom have come off the CETA and or the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. Premier Trump, in my view, has foolishly jettisoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the comprehensive deal with 12 other Pacific nations, including the U.S. and Mexico. But there's a lot in that agreement, inevitably, that will be applied in the upcoming negotiations. Preparing and negotiating the Canadian Game Plan has to involve all levels of government. This means the provinces and the national government working together like lips and teeth in preparation for the negotiations. The model, in my mind, should be the Canada-Europe trade negotiations, where the provinces were full partners and at the negotiating table. of critical importance will be the premiers with their governor counterparts and provincial members with their state counterparts. If we're to make the gains we want in terms of success in procurement, then that means states and contacts for Canadians. We need the states to be on side. Premier Wall needs to repeat, I think, the 2010 effort he made when he took a delegation of premiers to Washington during the National Governors Conference and negotiated a reciprocal agreement on procurement, purchasing. If Mr. Trump has his way, the United States procurement plan would be worth $1 trillion. That's the money we want to get our hands on. In the meantime, the Premier should create a standing committee of the Council of the Federation and figure out what it is we want from the United States and what we are prepared to give in return for gains. They should start, I think, with softwood lumber, because next month we're going to start paying through the nose for lumber exports to the United States. Softwood is a dispute dating back to George Washington's second term. Canada has a natural advantage in wood. Just simply go north and you see. Softwood lumber and its variation shakes and shingles threatened to derail the negotiations that ultimately led to the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in 1988. Forestry practices are a provincial responsibility, and the premiers need to figure this one out. Until then, the Americans will happily collect our dollars. Softwood lumber is also a reminder of the importance of having alternate markets than the United States. Business also has an important role. The big companies, the GEs and GMs, need to step up and warn President Trump of the threat to their supply chains. This next slide, you see this is manifold of a car, and you see that car parts made on both sides of the border before they're finally assembled on one part or the other. And this goes not just for cars, but computers, planes, and automobiles. Supply chains work for North America. We need to apply the people-to-people relationships, especially when prevailing policy is America first, and because, as President Trump declared in his inaugural address, we will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. The congressional hearings that are about to begin will generate a lot of heat and noise. Much of it will be aimed at Mexico, but Canada will also come in for its share of criticism. Canadians should not panic. It's a useful venting session that will give our negotiators a better sense of what will be on the American agenda when they sit down later this year to open up the now 23-year-old NAFTA. Some perspective. Quote, I've recently talked to a lot of Americans about how they perceive or misperceive Canada, U.S. trade. I have called their misperceptions the 7 deadly sins. I list them as follows. Canada is not America's biggest trading partner. That we try to keep the dollar low to gain an unfair trade advantage. That we have piled up huge trade surpluses. That we subsidize trade and the Americans don't. That public sector ownership automatically equals subsidy. That we are not the biggest energy supplier to the United States. And that a free trade agreement would benefit only Canada and not the United States. Sound familiar? The words aren't mine, but those of Alan Gottlieb, our longest-serving ambassador to the United States. In a speech he delivered in 1987, 30 years ago, to the Toronto Empire Club. As the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. My mother used to tell me that on an exam the key is to answer the question asked and not what I'd like to tell them. It was a lesson it took me some years to learn. So how do we manage Mr. Trump? How many of you have traveled to the United States in the last year or planning to go to the States in the next year? Just sort of raise your hand. Okay, it's 50% of the audience, easily. Well, I think we start with 3 main messages to Americans. First, we are a reliable ally and security partner. In the United States, security trumps everything else, so start every conversation reminding Americans that we have their back. When I was at the embassy in Washington, we produced this poster because we hadn't gone into Iraq, and what with freedom fries and the rest, we felt we had to do something. So we put these posters up at the entrance to Congress and to the Pentagon, and it got attention. Donald Rumsfeld, who was then Secretary of Defense, said he wanted to see something like it. Second, we are a fair and trusted trading partner. That's what Krista Freeland says, and she's right. Canada is the main market for 35 states and the second market for the rest. This next slide, those are the dark blue. Their main export market is Canada. For the lighter blue, it's the second biggest. So you see, we basically take all of the states. And if you look at this next slide, this is Trump. The blue states, the red states are Trump America. And if you notice, for most of Trump America, their first export market is the United States. And I think this is a message that the Premier is delivering right now in Washington. As I said earlier, U.S. trade with Canada generates 9 million jobs, and it's more than trade. It's making things together, as we talked about, through supply chains, and it works to our mutual advantages. One of my favorite factoids, Trump talks about equal trade and the rest. The average Canadian eats $629 worth of U.S. agri-food products annually. The average American spends $69 on Canadian food products. Third, Canada is a secure, stable, and reliable source of energy, something we have to remind them. Our power lights up Broadway, keeps the cable cars going in San Francisco, and powers the Mall of America in Minnesota, and it will fuel American manufacturing renaissance. With $2 billion in trade daily, Canada has a slight surplus because we provide 40% of U.S. energy imports. Otherwise, they enjoy the surplus. This was another we produced when I was there, and we used to put this up to the key messages: friend, neighbor, ally, and we still hang this poster out on the first week of between July 1st and July 4th at our embassy. Let me now give you 10 rules of the road that we Canadians need to think about in managing Mr. Trump and the U.S. relationship. First rule: what is our ask? What will we give? Know our facts. Messaging must be blunt and on point, and get to the point. It's not a level playing field. We only have a better than even chance when we are playing on ice. Second, we need to get our act together amongst all governments, with business, labor, and civil society. The Americans will exploit our differences to our cost, as we are learning, once again on softwood lumber, where they will happily collect the import levy until we get our act together. We have a good brand, but we need to develop it and use it more strategically. Americans like us more than we like them. And if you look at these next couple of slides, you see that the poll that Gallup does every year, there's Canada right at the top. So 92% of Americans put Canada as the country they most view favorably. The other 8%, of course, are the ones that don't like our hockey teams. The next slide shows you, this was last year's poll, but if you look, it's consistent. We are consistently, Americans view us very favorably. We don't view them quite the same enthusiasm. You see this next poll, but we still view them fairly favorably. As Margaret Atwood famously observed, when Americans look north, they look into a mirror and see a reflection of themselves. There are always more Americans, and think about this, that think like Canadians than there are Canadians. It's partly just that fraction of numbers of size. Canadians, of course, too often define themselves by what they are not. Americans, it's an insecurity, as I said earlier, we got to get over. Third rule: no surprises. Americans don't mind differences, but they don't like being blindsided, especially on security issues like ballistic missile defense or Iraq. And the linkage between issues is tricky and rarely works to our advantage. Relationships are everything. We would never have got the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement but for Brian Mulroney's friendship with Ronald Reagan. Our networks need 1,000 points of contact. And just a side on Reagan and Mulroney. We were finishing the negotiation on the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. I'd in fact gone home. I thought I was in Ottawa at the time, and it was after midnight in October, and we thought we were done because they held the clock up. Down in Washington, Derek Burney, who's going to be at Cabinet tomorrow with with Brian Mulroney, was negotiating with James Baker, then Secretary of the Treasury. And the sticking point, the final piece, was on dispute settlement. For Canada, absolutely vital piece of the deal. Americans didn't want to do it. Baker said, no, you can't have it. And so Derek Burney, Chief of Staff, says, all right, I've got to phone the Prime Minister who's in Bay Como. And what will happen then, says Baker? Well, he's going to phone the President. Baker pauses and says, well, he can't do that. He says, why? Because the President's in Yorba Linda watching a movie. And nobody ever interrupts Reagan when he's watching a movie. So Baker goes away and comes back and says, okay, you can have dispute settlement, but you may not get it through Congress. Well, in fact, we did get it through Congress. But I underline this, the relationships, the personal relationships really do matter a lot, and that's why I think it's really important the Premier is where he is today and why the Prime Minister has been going down on a regular basis and sending cabinet ministers, and why relationships, even for those around the room, when you go south, matter. Make it a U.S. issue and identify U.S. allies. This is how we got around various Buy America restrictions. Recently, for example, the U.S. acted against aluminum imports. The target was China, but as is often the case with U.S. protectionism, we got sideswiped. We make aluminum in Quebec. The workers are members of the United Steelworkers Union. The steelworkers have been particular advocates of Buy America, but they consider their Canadian brothers and sisters to be part of America, so we got an exemption. It helps that the President, Leo Gerard of the Steelworkers, is Canadian. A reminder that we need to make use also of the union ties that exist between Canada and the United States. We also have to play by their rules, so that means using lobbyists and lawyers. And if at first you don't succeed, try and try again. If you still aren't getting through, change your pitch. Practice and persistence is what makes perfect. Pitching is retail and a contact sport. Again, the Premier's demonstrating this right now. As an icebreaker, knowledge of U.S. college football and basketball is very useful, especially now March Madness. And a good way to meet Americans, join a church or a gun club. Number 6. This will come as perhaps no surprise to anybody out here. Ottawa does not have all the answers. The provinces have competence and experience. Trust the staff at our missions in the United States, the embassy and the consulates, for the read of the local environment. They know a lot. They've got a superb Rolodex of contacts. Number 7, the administration is our entry point, but the battleground is Congress and the states. We need to devote more attention to legislators, both in Congress and in the states. Special interests, business, labor, environmentalists, minorities represented by lawyers and lobbyists, fund legislators and drive dramatic policies like Buy America. Protection is as American as apple pie. A deep-rooted political response to structural problems in the United States. For legislators who have to raise hundreds daily, thousands daily, all politics is local. I'll just comment on legislators. My observation going to things like the Pacific Northwest Economic Region and Midwest state legislators is that this really is, it should be a Team Saskatchewan, Team Canada sport. And I used to see two of legislators that stood out in my mind were John Nielsen and Wayne Ilhart. Again, different parties, but they were extremely effective in working on behalf of Saskatchewan interests, but Canadian interests abroad. And so, again, encourage legislators to get out. Number 8, beware of noise and don't get spooked. A lot of what we're hearing now and what we will hear in the coming weeks of congressional hearings on NAFTA is positioning. The Americans are masters of positioning, and it will excite the excitable and give the Toronto Star a daily feed of dramatic headlines. This chart, by the way, if you look at that line, this is the amount of legislation that gets introduced in the U.S. Congress every year, about 10,000 bills. That yellow bar, these were 2 Congresses, is what gets introduced. That little tiny sliver at the top is what actually gets passed. Fortunately, we sometimes tend to think when something gets introduced, winds up a headline in the paper, it's very unlikely it's going to get through, which is why, again, learn to differentiate between the real and the improbable. The boogeyman out there right now is the border adjustment tax, the real threat because it is supported by House Speaker Paul Ryan. But the Americans also recognize that as in physics, for every action there is a reaction. If they adopt a border tax, so will we and other nations. Closest parallel would be the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that contributed mightily to the Great Depression. No one wants to go down that route. Most congressional legislation fails, as I pointed out, but as I say, we sometimes tend to behave like Chicken Little every time we see something we don't like. Again, their system is different from ours, with checks and balances and separation of powers. Next is go for gold. We are better than we think we are, but there's a Canadian tendency to think about compromise from the outset, a natural reflection of our national character that has to do, I think, a lot with coming to terms with climate and geography. But compromising before we sit down is a mistake with the Americans. We should not out-negotiate ourselves beforehand. In other words, ask for what we really want rather than what we think they'll give us. Nor should we expect gratitude or think for something we think we did for them. That's not a problem for the United States. As Mr. Trump personifies business is business and the business of America is business. Number 10, it's a permanent campaign that needs all hands on deck, all levels of government, business, labor, civil society, and ordinary Canadians who have American friends and family and who spend time in the United States. But if we play our cards right, we can both come out of this a winner. Further reading, former U.S. Ambassador David Jacobson used to say, Canadians think they know everything about Americans, and Americans think they know all they need to know about Canadians. We are, Jacobson said, both wrong. Here are some books in this next slide that I think of. One is Paul Bothwell's book on Canada-U.S. relations, and the other is Alan Gottlieb, his Washington memoirs, that you might want to look at to help you learn more about our favorite neighbor. In the next slide, this is on American politics. I particularly recommend Richard Haas's A World in Disarray. Haas was head of policy planning in the Bush administration's State Department and now heads the Council on Foreign Relations. And for real insight into the Trump administration, I strongly recommend J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. How many people in the room have read it? No, it really is a very good. It's I think the best insight into explaining a bit of the Trump phenomenon. I am worried about our southern neighbor, but the Founding Fathers designed a constitution to prevent another king. While Mr. Trump and George III may share certain attributes, the Constitution, with its checks and balances and separation of powers, also applies to Donald Trump. And it works. The courts overruled his executive order to keep out Muslims, and his Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch, was emphatic about the independence of the judiciary. Despite holding a majority in Congress, Obamacare remains the law of the land. And his national security team, Mr. Tillerson, Generals McMaster, Kelly, Mattis, are sound. Waterboarding is not coming back. I leave you with this observation from the greatest, in my view, modern observer of the United States, Alistair Cooke. As a boy, I listened to Alistair Cooke's Letters from America. He delivered his 15-minute broadcast weekly from 1946 to 2004, nearly 60 years to audiences around the world through the BBC. Those of you with hair my color might also remember him as the host of Masterpiece Theatre. While posted in New York, I met Cooke at the English-Speaking Union. He'd recently finished his epic television series on America, A Personal History of the United States, still worth watching. America in 1979 was going through a bad patch. New York City was dirty and crime was a problem. There were gas lines, and Jimmy Carter told people to turn down the heat and wear cardigans. The Russians had gone into Afghanistan, and I wondered about the United States and the West. I had the impression of a nation and our own civilization in decline. I asked Cooke what he thought of the future of the United States. He paused and said to me, in America, the race is always on between decadence and vitality. In America, there's lots of both. He paused, and then he reflected a bit more, and he said, but never underestimate another American quality, its remarkable resiliency. I think Cooke is right. And to end on a hopeful note, I give the last words to Winston Churchill. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Thank you.